Thank you, and I'd like to welcome everyone here to Sabbath Services, including our visitors and everyone out there on Zoom land. Nice to see you all again. So, Mr. Scapero was talking about how long he's known me, so I thought I would talk right now about age. So, when I was a kid, age 40 seemed to be way in the future. I mean, it was like way out there. I mean, anyone 40 years old back then, it was very old in a child's eyes. And now look at me now, here I am. But back then, I was also a big sports fan growing up. And I didn't remember many athletes playing past the age of 40, especially at their peak level. Now, I do remember Phil Niekro, the pitcher for the Cleveland Indians. He was in his 40s, still pitching, but that's because he threw the knuckleball. You really don't have to strain your arm that much to throw that. But for most athletes in baseball, football, and basketball, they don't play that well into their 40s, except maybe for Tom Brady. You know, Tom Brady has done a lot to show 40 years old isn't that old. I mean, this guy's going to be 45 years old in August, and is still performing at a high level. I mean, this guy feels so good that earlier this year, he decided to retire, like for a day or so, then he thought about it and came back. So obviously, he's still playing well. I mean, he's playing for so long, just like me growing up and remembering Terry Bradshaw playing, which I don't. All I remember him is some goofy guy on the TV that got hit in the head too many times. So I was told. I don't remember. But getting back to what I said earlier, back then I thought 40 was an older age. And when I started getting closer to 40, I thought, you know what? It just doesn't feel that bad, and it doesn't seem that old. And I think in recent years, maybe the stigma of being 40 has been kind of faded away. It's not considered that old anymore. But did you know how the number 40 is used in the Bible? Did you know you see the number 40 a lot in the Bible? So let's start out by taking a tour of the Bible of the number 40. Now, we all know about the story of Noah. You know how God flooded the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and how it only stopped raining after 40 days and 40 nights, and the human race, Noah's family, started a new life on the earth. Can you imagine what it was like to be on a boat that's rocking back and forth for 40 days and 40 nights? I mean, when they first went on dry land, they must have been like, whoa, what's going on here? I feel kind of dizzy, because I felt it before when I used to be on a boat growing up on Lake Erie, and be on the boat all day, you get on dry land, you feel kind of dizzy. But 40 days and 40 nights on a boat, I mean, it's happened a lot, I'm sure, in the modern era with people traveling to North America under the 1500s and 1600s and 17, 1800s, but that was something where you couldn't have any dry land back then. Or how about the number 40 in Moses' lifetime? Now, 40 in Moses' lifetime appears a lot in the Bible. For example, in Acts chapter 7, verse 23, I'm going to read here from the New King James Version, Acts chapter 7, verse 23. It says, Stephen was speaking, "Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian." So we find out from Stephen in the book of Acts how Moses was actually living in Egypt for the first 40 years of his life before he actually killed that Egyptian. So that was his first 40-year period of his life. And then in verse 30 of Acts chapter 7, we read, "And when 40 years had passed, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai." So we see Moses, after he fled Egypt at the age of 40, he lived in the wilderness, got married, had some children, before God called him from a burning bush when he was about 80 years old. That was his second part of his 40 years. Then finally, we know from Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 7 that Moses was 120 years old when he died. So you see, Moses' life was divided in 3 separate 40s. Now, within his life, the number 40 in the Old Testament also played a significant part. For example, Exodus 24 and verse 18 tells us that Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. And then Moses writes in Deuteronomy chapter 9 in verses 18 and in verse 25 how he interceded for Israel for 40 days and 40 nights so that God would not destroy Israel. Can you imagine that you are so determined to make sure that God does not destroy the children of Israel that you plead with him for 40 days and 40 nights? That shows what kind of man Moses was. That showed he tried his best to save Israel, and he was not giving up until God relented. And then we all know the famous story from Moses' time, when God sent spies from Israel into the promised land before they would actually go in there to take it over. And the spies were in the promised land for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, a very long time, so the spies would have enough time to check out the promised land, to check it out what the land was like. However, when the spies brought back a bad report, God punished Israel by having them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies spent in the promised land. Now, some of you may say, well, 40 years isn't that bad to be wandering in the wilderness. I mean, look at the Cleveland Browns. They've been wandering longer than that since they have found the promised land. And you're true, right? You're right about that. I mean, very few people here remember that. I mean, maybe Thomas might remember that, but that's about it. Joshua tells us that he was 40 years old in Joshua 14 in verse 7 when he was sent out as a spy in the land of Canaan. So we see 40 again where a person becomes like a leader. We know that Israel served the Philistines for 40 years before Samson delivered them. Judges chapter 13 verse 1 says that. We see King David, King Solomon, they each reigned over Israel for 40 years. 40 years seems to symbolize a generation here. And then there's Elijah, the prophet. Elijah had to flee from Jezebel after he had all the prophets of Baal killed. And he was afraid of her, so he fled to the wilderness, and God had to feed Elijah for 40 days and 40 nights, just long enough for Elijah to get out of his depression and to move on and to his next chapter of his life. Another example of 40 in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we know the story of Jonah. Jonah was swallowed up by a whale, as we all know, for 3 days and 3 nights, and we all know what that symbolized. Well, when Jesus Christ would be buried for 3 days and 3 nights. But then when the whale vomited him back up, he went to Nineveh. And when he went to Nineveh, he prophesied that God was going to destroy them. Do you remember how much time Jonah prophesied that God would give Nineveh before God destroyed them? Jonah chapter 3 verse 4 tells us they had 40 days before God would destroy them. But then Nineveh understood that, and they had just enough time to repent, to change their ways for a brief period of time, and God relented from destroying Nineveh. Now let's look at what the New Testament and see how the number 40 plays out there. I'm sure we all know the story of how before Jesus started his ministry, he fasted 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. And then after he was hungry, it says in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, it says Satan tempted him. So Jesus was fasting and praying for 40 days, 40 nights, getting ready to start his ministry, preparing for it. And then when it is at his weakest, here comes Satan testing him to try to get him to falter, to try to get him to sin. But Jesus was strong enough through the prayer and fasting that he did not let Satan make him sin, and he passed the test. We also know in the New Testament that after Jesus Christ was resurrected, he appeared to his disciples for how long? It was 40 days. This in Acts chapter 1 and verse 3. Now, 40 appears a number of other times in the Bible. So I just gave you a brief grand tour of the number 40 in the Bible. So what can we make of this, and what does this mean for us? What kind of analogies can we draw from the number 40 in the Bible? Well, one of the analogies we can draw from the number 40, it seems like that every time, a majority of the time, when the 40 shows up, it seems to be a period of trial or testing. A trial or testing. For example, Jesus Christ was in the wilderness fasting before he went through the trial of Satan. And he was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. We also know the spies in the land of Canaan were in the land of Canaan and tested for 40 days and 40 nights to see what kind of report they would provide. Israel then had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they had to be tested, and their children would then eventually learn and come into the promised land. So what we learn here in the analogy is that we too are tested, and we are given time. God gives us time to try to pass the test and to become closer to him, which brings us to the second analogy, preparation. It seems like number 40 deals with being prepared. For example, God prepared Moses to lead Israel by first being a prince in Egypt for 40 years. But then, after that 40 years, Moses was trained again. He was prepared to lead Israel by spending time as a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years, from ages 41 to 80. It took him 40 years to learn all the skills in the wilderness that he will need and would need to lead Israel out of Egypt. And then, of course, he spent the last 40 years of his life leading Israel out of Egypt. He was prepared in doing that already. We see how Jesus also spent 40 days after his resurrection preparing his disciples for his departure so they would start preaching the gospel and be ready for the day of Pentecost. The other analogy we can look at 40 is that it may seem like a long time, like when you're a kid, when I was young, like when we were all younger, 40 seemed to be a long off. But when we get to 40, we realize that time is limited. It's not that far off. It reminds us that we only have so much time here on the earth to prepare ourselves for God's kingdom. It is not a very long time when you get up to 40 years. And you especially realize that when you get closer and hit that. Psalms chapter 103, verses 13 through 18, let's turn there what David said about time. Psalms 103, verses 13 through 18. And here David writes, 13 through 18. Okay, as the Father, 15 through 18. As for man, his days are like grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourishes. For the wind passes over it, and it is gone. Ever see a flower in the field, those dandelions when they get old and the wind blows, and then it just disappears. The petals disappear. But verse 17, but the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children, to such as keep his covenant, and to those who remember his commandments to do them. So, 40 is only a small period of time. Our life on earth is not that long, but God's commandments, it's saying here, and his laws endure forever. And it says here that we need to put that as a priority in our lives to be prepared for God's kingdom, to learn now how to obey him and be ready to obey him. And then in Ephesians chapter 5, in verses 15 through 21, we'll turn there, about how time is limited and how it relates to number 40. Ephesians chapter 5, in verses 15 through 21. And Paul writes, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. And are the days getting more evil, even more evil now than they were back then when Paul wrote this? Therefore, verse 17, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. If you read verse 16, where it says, redeeming the time, because the days are evil, from the New Century Version, it says this, use every chance you have for doing good, because these are evil times. So I think this New Century Version makes it a little bit more clearer what Paul is saying, that, hey, we only have so much time. We only have so much time left here on the earth. We have to use our time here on the earth to do good, to do what's right. to obey God. Because, why? We're living in evil times, and it's not going to get any better. So what did we learn today is that we saw the number 40 used numerous times in the scripture. We see that 40 was associated with a time for preparation, that where we have to be prepared for the coming kingdom. It's a time for us to be productive also. We need to use it to redeem our time, a time to do good, a time to make ourselves better, and to be ready for the future, and especially for God's kingdom. Because as we all know, God's commandments are forever, and he does prophesy, and what he says will come true. Have a wonderful Sabbath.